What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Bitcoin and Markets. Happy Friday. Hope you're doing well out there. Huge day for Bitcoin. We're going to take a look at some of the news that dropped today, take a look at the charts. And then I wanted to react to a couple videos that were requested from the Telegram community. I am live streaming on YouTube, Rumble, Twitter, and Telegram. I try to live stream 3 times a week, so you can catch me about, in the afternoon, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I am on the Telegram channel pretty much 24/7. And you can find that t.me/Bitcoin and markets. Okay, let's share the screen and jump right into it. Where are we going first? Of course, bitcoinandmarkets.com. That is my homepage for everything that I do. I also put out all of these live streams. I try to put them out as quickly as I can on podcast. So you guys can find me on the podcast apps. I do a weekly newsletter every Monday, most comprehensive newsletter in Bitcoin, the Bitcoin Insider. And I also do blog posts. I haven't been writing so much over the last month or so through the holidays and into the new year, but I am still planning on writing as much as I can. I've been working on getting my thesis tied down. I want to do a real big series of posts on my evolutionary monetary theory, EMT, and try to get that out to, introduce people to my unique macro thesis. So that's bitcoinandmarkets.com. All right, let's jump into the chart. You can see on the daily here, big day, 5% candle up over 105, almost touching 106. Let's see, 105,932 was the high. RSI is not oversold, so we have plenty of room to go there. Let's take a look at the MACD. If I bring this up, MACD has crossed back very bullish, so this is a great sign. This one kind of got me, um, that trapped me a little bit in a bull trap because I thought we were going to front run the inauguration from this point last week. We had a cross in the MACD. Everything looked nice and ready to do that front run. But then we had one more sell off before the inauguration. But right now, it is still possible before the inauguration, which would be pretty crazy. Usually on the weekends, it's very slow. And so we don't see a lot of activity, gaps on the chart from, like usually a gap will be when there's after hours trading and the price moves significantly. And so there's this gap in the chart. Bitcoin usually avoids that by just trading sideways throughout the weekend. But it's still possible that we rally all the way to an all-time high over the weekend before the inauguration on Monday. I'm not sure what time of day that happens, probably noon or early afternoon. And then we'll start seeing maybe some executive orders start flying from Trump. One thing that he can do immediately is repeal SAB 121, which is on Michael Saylor's checklist to get to $1 million Bitcoin or whatever it was. And so we could see that on day one. We could also see some other things about Ross Ulbricht and a Bitcoin strategic reserve, but we will see how that turns out on Monday. Okay, big day today for Bitcoin was a lot of, now I don't have the tweet pulled up. Stand by one second. I think it was retweeted by Bitcoin Magazine. I'll share my screen here in just a second. Here it is. So big day today. We crossed that 105 mark, approaching an all-time high. First Union, which I think is probably like a regional bank in Idaho, I'm not sure about that. They have announced that they bought Bitcoin. California had an official come out and say that they were embracing Bitcoin, but they haven't introduced a Bitcoin bill as far as I understand. Wyoming filed for a Bitcoin strategic reserve in their state legislature, as well as Massachusetts. So I think that makes 8 or 9 states. Some of these are very significant, like Texas and Florida, Pennsylvania. Massachusetts is up there. What is Massachusetts GDP? we will find 760 billion. So Pennsylvania actually has a larger GDP than Massachusetts, but this is a big blue stronghold. So I don't think that this bill will get passed, but we're starting to come into like a snowball effect. If Trump comes in and overturns SAB 121, which is right now stopping banks from custodying Bitcoin for their clients, if he repeals that, and that is unilateral because it's an SEC rule, it's not any sort of legislation. It's just an interpretation of a rule from the SEC. So he can unilaterally overturn that, and he can unilaterally turn the Bitcoin that's being held by the U.S. government into a Bitcoin strategic reserve. Not necessarily buy more Bitcoin. He would need legislative power to buy a significant amount of Bitcoin. But just turning what we already have into a strategic reserve, I think is highly, highly likely within the first 24 hours that he's in office. So if all of those things happen, we could start seeing a snowball effect. Texas passing it, Florida, of course, maybe Wyoming, other countries, the UAE coming out and disclosing that they have 300,000, if they have 300,000 Bitcoins. Other Gulf states, perhaps like Qatar. There was talk already in the Japanese legislature about a Bitcoin strategic reserve. They didn't go that way, but that's possible. We have Facebook, who is supposed to be discussing putting Bitcoin on their balance sheet. They have $72 billion in cash. They could put some of that into Bitcoin. And, just a snowball effect globally within a very short period of time. So it's very, very exciting. We will see what happens after the inauguration. Guys, you can put your comments down below. I am live streaming, like I said, on YouTube, Rumble, Twitter, and Telegram. You can find those links in my pinned tweet if you are on X right now. John Delaney, what's up? Dex Invictus back with us. Thanks for joining, guys. Hope you are having a good Friday. Okay, let's jump into a couple of these videos. I wanted to take a look at this one. Let's see who requested this one. Just going to scroll up in the Telegram. And this was from Boog. So Boog, you're a Boyle fan. I am too. His videos are so dense. And so we were going to watch this, and I will comment throughout. I'll try to keep my comments pretty minimal because, like I said, it's very, very dense. And he does a good job, I think, on describing this. But there's a few points where I differ from what he says here. So let's just check the volume. And if the volume is not okay, guys, put it down in the chat. I appreciate that. BTCP, happy Friday. All right, let's play.
In 2024, a major concern amongst voters in both Europe and the United States was immigration. According to a Gallup survey, 2024 was the first year since 2005 that a majority of Americans wanted there to be less immigration, and the percentage opposing immigration hit the highest level since 2001. The US is home to the world's largest foreign-born population, where according to the Census Bureau, immigrants make up 14.3% of the population. As of 2022, Mexicans made up 23% of the total immigrant population, Indians made up 6%, Chinese 5%, and Filipinos 4%. The majority of these people are legally in the country, but experts estimate that there are between 11 million and 13 million illegal immigrants in the United States.
It seems like the highest proportion is Mexicans. That's understandable since they are on the border, but I thought there was a much higher percentage of like Guatemalans and people from Honduras and Venezuelans and stuff like that. I guess maybe they wouldn't be considered unauthorized. I'm not sure. But yeah, that's kind of surprising that those other Central American countries didn't break into the top 3-4 countries.
And between 8 and 10 million illegal immigrants work in the country, which is as much as 6% of the entire US workforce. Nearly half of the illegal immigrants live in 4 states: California, Florida, New York, and Texas, with many working in agriculture, in the service sector, and in construction. Immigration has been a signature issue for Donald Trump, who's advocated for slashing both legal and illegal immigration. Trump famously vowed to build a wall along the US-Mexico border to stop drugs and gangs from getting into the country. He was unable to get funding from Congress to do this, which led to a government shutdown in 2019 and a declaration of a national emergency, which allowed him to divert funds to build the wall. Biden campaigned on overturning Trump's immigration policies and once elected reduced immigration enforcement within the country, focusing instead on addressing the drivers of migration from Central America. The Trump administration used a public health law to allow US officials to quickly turn back migrants at the border on public health grounds at the start of the pandemic in 2020. The Biden administration initially kept this restriction in place, but tried to end its use in 2022. Republicans sued and the courts kept the rule in place. In 2023, when the Biden administration announced that it was ending the national pandemic emergency, these border restrictions went away. That year, Customs and Border Protection apprehended almost 2.5 million people illegally crossing the southern border, which was a record high. While historically the people illegally crossing the southern border were Mexicans seeking work, between 2013 and 2021, most immigrants came from Asia, particularly China and India, and most were seeking asylum. A Biden administration rule prohibiting non-Mexican migrants from seeking asylum at the southern border if they hadn't first applied for it and been denied in at least one other country along their route ended a lot of that immigration. Mexico once again regained its status as the top country of origin, with a growing number of Central Americans joining them. While Trump made border control
I think it's interesting. I'm not any border security expert or immigration expert, but it's interesting that, remember the videos like with Elon Musk down there at the border, and you just have these people walking in. I mean, thousands of people just walking in every day. Were they apprehended? Are they counted in these numbers? I mean, I have a feeling that they're not those official numbers of illegal immigrants are not even close to the actual number. I mean, it sounds a lot. 11,000 11 million illegal immigrants. It could be 20. It could be 30 million. We don't know. I mean, it probably 30 million might be stretching it, but yeah, I first question all of these numbers, and Patrick Boyle, he's a little bit more legitimate than I am, I guess, and so he's not going to question these type of official numbers. But I definitely would. I would say that there's probably twice as many as the official numbers show.
signature issue, he deported just 1.2 million people during his first term in office, which was lower than Obama deported in either of his two terms. A surge in unaccompanied minors arriving at the US border began in 2014, and Obama faced criticism at the time for detaining children in poor conditions and deporting more than 3 million immigrants, which was more than either Clinton or Bush had done. While Biden technically repatriated more illegal immigrants than either Obama or Trump did, the majority were turned back due to Trump's public health law, which Biden tried to end in 2022 and actually ended in 2023, after which a surge of migrants crossed the border seeking asylum. Trump promised mass deportations on the campaign trail, but deportations like he's promised are more complicated than increased border security. They involve
One thing also is, yeah, it was a bipartisan thing. You just saw the chart of ramping up under Bush, high under Obama, crashing under Trump. And then Biden being forced to keep some of those same rules in place. But they wanted to get rid of it. And again, those are not counting full counts of the people that have come in. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say that Trump and Biden wanted the same thing, or that they were both doing the same enforcement, which they absolutely 100% were not doing the same enforcement. And so I agree that there has been some continuity in these from 4 years to the next 4 years, but that is not the full picture. That is absolutely not the full picture, especially when then you consider things like UN debit cards. Remember that guy? There was an arsonist that was caught down in California on the street, and the citizens held him until the cops came, and they found a UN debit card and a bunch of passports in his pocket. And so, these immigrants are being paid to come in here. And so that you have to say, what's the incentive? Like, what are they? Everything's about incentives. And what is the incentive to give these people debit cards to come into the country? Well, obviously, that's the role of the globalists. And the Biden administration is the manifestation of the globalists in the United States. So I don't know. It's a little bit disingenuous to make a one-to-one comparison, even though there was some continuity in the actual laws, the enforcement, and other extraneous programs are not being taken into account in this assessment.
Illegal immigrants, arresting and detaining them, and if he's to be taken at his word, getting rid of 6% of the US workforce. None of this will be cheap to do, and it can be expected to have wide-ranging economic consequences. As Trump advocates for his mass deportation plan, he has said that there's no price tag attached to the endeavour, but the costs of these proposals, both financial and social, will likely be a point of contention. There have been a lot of articles already on this story. Topics like this can be highly politicized, and if you're looking to get a balanced view of what's going on, you'll want to check out today's video sponsor, Ground News. It's a website and app that shows you news coverage from across the world and political spectrum, providing a data to share factual information with you, my viewers. Subscribe or scan the QR code on screen to get up to 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan that I use. Sarah O'Connor wrote an excellent piece in the FT last month about how economists have spent years lecturing a skeptical public that migrants don't suppress wages, as while they do increase the supply of labour, they also increase the demand for goods and services. So in the end, one offsets the other and wages stay roughly the same. Now that Trump is planning to deport millions of illegal immigrants, they're saying that this will cause labour shortages, increasing wages and inflation. She asks in her article, how can both of these claims be true? Similarly, analysts are warning that Trump's policies are inflationary and will hit economic growth. But investors, on the other hand, are betting that his plans will boost earnings and lift the stock market even higher.
One thing I'll just throw out here is every time they use inflation, what they're talking about price inflation and not actual money supply inflation. So, it's difficult to say what the impact will be on actual money printing versus what it will be on prices, because if we have, if prices go up, this is what Bessent said. He was asked about this, the inflation and tariffs and immigration and stuff. He said, like, if prices go up, that means your disposable income for other things goes down. And so the demand for other things will go down and prices elsewhere will go down. And so the net change is zero. And that's actually insightful. Most people probably don't like that. And especially in Bitcoin, they don't like that. But to get actual sustained price increases, you have to have money printing. And when you just slap a tariff on, that has nothing to do with money printing, right? That's just changing the supply side of the equation. And so, yeah, you could have some temporary increases in certain prices, but you will have decreases in other prices. And eventually, if this rise in price is harmful to the economy, you will have a general decrease in demand as you go into a recession or your economy slows down. And so every time Boyle here says inflation, he's not talking about money printing. He's talking about prices, which are extremely complicated. I don't trust anybody that says they know what will happen to prices if they do this immigration thing or if they do the tariff thing, because we just don't know. It's very complex, and we don't know how long the effects will last, back and forth, right? Because when you talk about prices and inflation, you have to detail out the mechanism, the method of action. And it's not so simple to say tariffs will cause inflation. That is misleading, very misleading.
Once again, one of the two must be wrong. The first thing we need to address is the question of, is there actually an open border, as some people have been claiming? And why have so many migrants been crossing the southern US border in recent years? There is, of course, not an open border. There are US laws in place making it illegal to cross the border without permission. What's changed under Joe Biden is the way in which laws were enforced. I spoke off the record with an immigration attorney who explained the increased number of border crossings is partially driven by the better treatment of illegals who today mostly turn themselves in once they've crossed the border and claim asylum. Apparently, the rise of social...
Yeah, they claim asylum and they get their UN debit cards and free room and board. No, I also think it's disingenuous here. I understand why he does it, because he has to walk the politically correct line here and say that there isn't an open border. But if there's no penalty and there's only benefit, there's only actual reward for crossing the border, you get a debit card and room and board, and probably connections to get you a job and stuff like that. So no, even if you enter illegally and you claim asylum, that's an open border as far, practically speaking. So of course it's open border. It has been an open border for the last few years. And again, we don't know these numbers that he was claiming at the front, if those are legit still.
Media means that successful migrants are able to tell people back in their home country how to get across, which attracts even more migrants. The asylum process has always existed, but under prior administrations, asylum seekers had to prove that they had a legitimate claim straight away. Right now, people cross the border, ask for asylum, and get released pending a trial. And due to court backlogs, it can take up to 7 years for their cases to be decided.
7 years.
Once they've turned themselves in and applied for asylum, they are now legally in the United States and can apply for work permits, which takes at least 180 days.
So that's basically saying it's an open border.
They are not eligible for federal benefits, food stamps, or Social Security, but there are some exceptions for unaccompanied minors and survivors of torture.
Well, they're not eligible for this stuff from the federal government, but they're eligible for it from the UN and other money laundering operations, okay? Other NGOs, other things like that. So, who's paying for them to be put up in all these hotels? Who's paying for their debit cards? All this stuff. So yes, they are eligible not for federal public benefits, but for private or state or whatever the case. And so, yeah, again, this is misleading.
Who are eligible for some benefits. I'm told that in the past, it was considered so unpleasant dealing with US authorities under Trump and Obama that it deterred many migrants from even considering entering the United States. The booming US economy of the last few years, evidenced by the recent jobs report, which blew through expectations, has attracted migrants who face significantly greater difficulties in their home countries than in the United States.
Blowing through expectations, but remember, the full-time employment dropped. It was only the part-time temporary workers that increased. And if you go back for, I don't know how many years, probably 8 years, and you look at the number of jobs for foreign-born versus native-born workers, the native-born workers have actually lost jobs over the last 8 years, where the foreign-born workers have actually gained the jobs. Now, in this video, I'm not trying to be political about it. I'm trying to point out that one, this is a harder question. Two, it's going to happen. Okay, we're going to close the border and we're going to start deporting at least the criminals and other people. So that is going to happen. But also just listening to what he has to say and dissecting some misleading statements from some more true statements.
According to the DHS, people from over 168 different countries have crossed the southern border into the United States over the last 3 years. The number of migrants peaked in December 2023, and according to data from US Customs and Border Protection, the number of illegal migrants plummeted in 2024. The decline came after policy changes on both sides of the border, where authorities in Mexico stepped up enforcement and President Biden issued an executive order over the summer making it harder for migrants to seek asylum and remain in the country. While this issue can seem quite politicized and
the state of Texas put up their borders, right? Put up that floating border in the middle of the river on the most trafficked areas. So it wasn't just the continuity between different administrations or what Biden was doing. It was also what he was forced to do through court cases and actions of the other states. You had people like Ron DeSantis putting these immigrants onto planes and flying them to Martha's Vineyard, right into the heart of the blue sanctuary cities that said, "Oh, we want these immigrants." That was also happening last year and in 2023. So, no, it's not just it's Biden's reaction to other things.
Rhetoric around immigration can get quite heated. Hopefully you can see from this brief history that both Republicans and Democrats have been trying to get the balance right between the need for workers in the United States and the resources available.
Again, walking this diplomatic tightrope. The Democrats have not been doing that at all.
It's worth remembering that both the share of the US population that's of working age and the ratio of workers to retirees are declining as Americans live longer and have fewer children. As the American population ages, America needs more immigrants for the economy to continue thriving.
I think this is the strongest argument for immigration, but it can be legal immigration, So there's a ton of people that want to come over here that are doctors or PhDs or engineers or, professionals, and it's very hard. So my wife is in the medical profession, and she knows doctors that are surgeons, specialists, that every few years, I think it's 3 or 4 years, they have to reapply. And I mean, they're working for major hospitals, and they see delays. This one doctor, she said, thought he had this delay, and he thought he was going to have to go home because the actual process for the people, the skilled labor that you would want to come into a country, it's very hard. So yeah, there's a balancing act. I know there's a lot of people that discuss this constantly. There was the H-1B debate just recently that Vivek kind of disappeared after. Now he's back again. But it is a pretty hard question, and I think that the demographic part of it is the best argument for letting more immigration in. But again, it's a balancing act because immigration does shift culture. Even though I'm less worried about that, a lot of people are worried about, if you let in too many immigrants and the culture is going to shift. I think culture is heavily dependent on geography. And so I think that, after just a few generations or even one generation of people coming over here, a high percentage of them will be at least integrated into the culture and understand the American culture. And so, again, with culture being heavily dependent on geography, it doesn't really matter as much as what many people say on the right, that oppose immigration because it's going to affect our culture. I'm less on that boat.
Otherwise, it runs the risk of ending up like Japan. Immigration reform has been needed for quite some time. The last major legislation to make it through Congress came under Ronald Reagan in 1986, when his administration granted legal amnesty to 3 million undocumented residents. In 1990, George Bush Sr. more than doubled the cap for immigrant visas from 270,000 to 700,000. In 2007, George Bush Jr. tried to pass an immigration bill which didn't make it through the Senate. In 2013, Obama tried to pass a bill which stalled in the House of Representatives. Trump and Biden both put forth plans which went nowhere. While Trump ramped up anti-immigrant rhetoric on the campaign trail, the measures...
But again, that's misleading because they could put up legislation that they know will not be approved. They've done this in very recently, where Biden put forth some spending bill that had, or no, was it spending bill? I think it was spending bill, and it had hidden in it all of this stuff about immigration, and so they had to vote against it in Congress, and then they could use that as a rhetorical cudgel and say, "You guys voted against this bill." Well, yeah, we voted against it because you put all this hidden stuff in there. And so, no, it's not as simple as what Patrick is saying here, where they put forth this immigration legislation. Yeah, it was politics, man. It was politics. the bottom line is the Democrats don't want to close the border. The Republicans want to close the border. That's the whole thing here. And you can't just say, oh, this guy introduced a bill, because that is misleading.
He's proposing would not actually be the most extreme anti-immigrant policies in US history. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 effectively banned Chinese immigration to the United States for 83 years until its repeal in 1943.
Okay, I want to take a look at comments here real quick. So John Delaney had one. He said that you have to take into account the immigrants, the population of the country of origin, as a base to evaluate the immigration potential. So Honduras, while closer, is less populous than China. Yes, I agree with that. But it is harder for the Chinese to get here. I have seen a video where they went all the way up from Colombia or something. Like they got dropped off in Colombia, then they went through the trail all the way through Central America and all the way up. It was a bunch of Chinese and Middle Eastern and Indian people. So yes, but their path is a lot harder than just starting in Honduras or Guatemala and coming up. But I agree. I wonder the percentage of these part-time jobs are from illegal immigrants seeking asylum. That's a very good question. I would say these illegal immigrants, they can't actually work, as far as I know. Maybe if you seeking asylum, didn't he say 180 days you have to wait for a work permit? So those people probably wouldn't be counted, but they would be a significant proportion, I'm guessing. Okay, let's continue.
Immigration Act of 1924 was more extreme too, establishing national origin quotas to limit the number of immigrants allowed into the United States to 2% of the number of people of that nationality in the country as of 1890. This was enacted to preserve the racial composition of the country and was praised by an Austrian immigrant who had moved to Germany named Adolf Hitler, who is very much not a friend of the show. He praised the act in 1928 for banishing strangers of the blood. Tom Homan, Trump's border czar, who worked under both Obama and Trump in the past, has said that the administration will begin deportations with the worst first, meaning migrants who are in the country illegally and have been convicted of crimes. On Fox News, he also said that worksite raids would have to happen too. Some of his comments on visa programs have made employers worried that Trump could reduce legal immigration too.
I don't like bringing the stuff about pure blood and stuff into the conversation. It's not about that. I think if they just had, if the Democrats, if they just would have vetted people better, they probably would have not instigated such a bad reaction. I mean, they could have had a ton of illegals coming through, but if they just screened out for those people coming from prisons and other things in Venezuela or wherever they're coming from, with tattoos on their face for how many people they killed and all this stuff, you could have kept the reaction from MAGA and Republicans to a minimum, but you didn't do that. So it's not about race. It's about the criminality of these people. Of many of them, not all of them, obviously.
Range of possible outcomes over the next 4 years. Trump could limit the length of time for which a visa is valid and make it harder to get visas with increased fees and waiting times. This would reduce the number of people granted green cards. He can also limit the number of refugees accepted. Trump plans to restart his policy requiring migrants at the southern border to await court hearings in Mexico, which would require cooperation from the Mexican government. He says that he'll end a government scheme that lets migrants make appointments to apply for asylum using an app. He also intends to end programs offering some nationalities work permits, but not a path to citizenship.
That app thing is just insane, man. So they have this app where you can go in there and apply for asylum or schedule your illegal migration and then apply for asylum all in an app. I mean, providing that app, how can you say that they don't want these people to come here? I mean, it's kind of crazy.
The mass deportations that Trump has promised can't happen without extra funding from Congress. Trump's border czar, Homan, has acknowledged that the breadth of that operation largely depends on how much money Congress provides for it. Trump has vowed to end birthright citizenship too, saying that he would take executive action to circumvent the 14th Amendment, which guarantees citizenship to people born in the United States. Birthright citizenship was introduced in 1868 to guarantee citizenship to all former slaves and to any child born on US soil. Birthright tourism has been controversial in recent years as wealthy foreign women fly to the United States often on tourist visas and stay just long enough to give birth and obtain birth certificates and passports for their children. Most other countries don't offer this right, and usually at least one of a child's parents must already be a citizen. Nearly all of the countries with unrestricted birthright citizenship are in North America or South America, and the US and Canada are the only two NATO countries with this right. Ending birthright citizenship would probably not be able to be done by executive order, as Trump has suggested, and would likely require a constitutional amendment or a very different interpretation of the Constitution by the Supreme Court.
I don't know anything about that birthright citizenship. Trump has some legal experts, so I don't think that he would just say something offhanded. And I know it's a long simmering thing, so there's good arguments on both sides, I'm sure. And yeah, it probably has to be settled by the Supreme Court. But it is, I would say, in a gray area where some executive action could be taken, and then they would sue to go up to the Supreme Court and get clarity from the Supreme Court. Just the same way that, well, it's not the same way, because I'm thinking of like Biden and the student loan forgiveness. He just did that unilaterally, and then they got sued, went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said you can't do that. And so then he did it again anyway, and just totally disregarded what the Supreme Court said. I'm not saying that that's what Trump can do here, because this is a legal gray area that has good arguments on both sides for decades. And so this would be something that they could do to force the issue, not to overstep their powers, right? But to force the issue.
Has talked about stripping citizenship from people who have illegitimately received birthright citizenship too, which would make them immediately subject to deportation. While people can be stripped of citizenship under US law, it happens under very specific circumstances, like running for political office in a foreign country, entering into military service in a foreign country, committing an act of treason against the US, and things like that. Changing the rules around birthright citizenship probably wouldn't happen very quickly. The bigger question is, how would Trump's mass deportations, if enacted, affect the US economy? There would obviously be huge costs associated with rounding up 8 to 10 million people, holding them in detention facilities and processing them through the courts. Additionally, it would be hugely disruptive for an economy to lose 6% of its workforce, especially in an environment where labor is in tight supply. You can think of an economy as being like a machine that combines labor, capital, and raw materials to produce goods and services. If we suddenly...
And skill. Labor, capital. I mean, I guess within labor you would say skill, but it's also entrepreneurship and management and creativity and insightfulness. It's not just, let's mix these things in a pot and we'll get an economy. So that's a little bit reductive.
Remove 6% of the labor from that equation, we end up with lower output. On top of that, deporting millions of people who consume goods and services would also reduce demand in the economy. Tom Homan, Trump's border czar, says that he'll need 100,000 additional detention beds, about double the existing number, to process the deportations he's planning. This number seems way too small if the plan is to deport more than 10 million people over the next 4 years. The American Immigration Council estimates that the US would need to build and maintain 24 times more ICE detention capacity than currently exists to deport 1 million immigrants a year. This is the reason that prison company stocks rallied so much when the election results were announced. The AIC estimates that to carry out even 1 million deportations a year, ICE would need to hire around 30,000 new enforcement officers, which would instantly make it the largest law enforcement agency in the federal government. At present, there are 3.7 million cases pending before 735 US immigration judges, and this backlog means that immigrants wait an average of 3 years for a decision. People who lose their cases can appeal, and their deportations take even longer. Trump would need to significantly increase the number of judges and find ways to expedite court cases. Transporting migrants back to their home countries is expensive too.
Well, you could expedite court cases. I mean, you could expedite the problem by simply cutting off the flow. I think that would go a long way.
In 2023, the head of ICE told Congress that an average removal flight costs about $17,000 an hour. It's estimated that mass deportations on the scale being discussed would cost around $1 trillion and take at least 10 years to complete. In order to pay for this, Trump could possibly declare a national emergency like he did in 2019 to use defense funds to help fund the border wall. There would be other costs associated with mass deportations too. According to the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, undocumented immigrants pay just under $100 billion in federal, state, and local taxes per year. Most of these taxes go to the federal government, so undocumented immigrants are good for the federal budget, but often weigh on state and local governments who are responsible for supplying schooling and healthcare and other services, but don't receive as much tax revenue in return.
All right. Well, let me get off that screen. $1 trillion to do these plans. I mean, that is just lack of creativity. $7,000 for a flight. You can do it. I mean, that's what we need Doge for. You could do it a lot cheaper than that. And also the $1 billion in federal, state, and local taxes that he was talking about, just because you take, I mean, that money is still going to be in the economy. It's still going to be spent by someone. So that figure doesn't hold up either. So it might not be 100, like they just say 100 billion. They have 100 billion. They're responsible for 100 billion in taxes. But if you take those people out, it's not like those taxes don't get paid by somebody else. Maybe you lose only 10% of that, maybe 10 billion, right? So all of these numbers that he's stating here are, I think, he is taking them as a given. And yes, you have to start somewhere in your analysis. I agree with that, but I think he's over reliant on these types of numbers in his analysis here, and that it's too analytical for me. It's not creative enough. You have to say, okay, well, look, they're probably going to come up with some cool plan that we're not even thinking of right now that can do this for a tenth of the cost, right? And so it's not thinking outside the box enough. It's just going by the numbers. And then you have to ask, where are these numbers coming from? These numbers are coming from most likely globalist friendly places that want these immigrants to come in.
Don't receive as much tax revenue in return. Stephen Miller, who's expected to take a leading role in implementing Trump's immigration agenda, has claimed that mass deportations would create jobs for Americans and increase wages. There are some real-world tests on the effects of mass deportations on labour market outcomes for US-born workers, one of the best ones being by Eastlock, Mansour and Velasquez of the University of Colorado, who studied the rollout of Obama's deportations, which were implemented county by county between 2008 and 2014. The timing of the removals was based on how close the counties were to ICE offices and how quickly the IT infrastructure needed could be set up in a county. The study found that there were 8 jobs lost for US-born workers for every 100 deportations. This was analysed over a 4-year timescale, and there was no sign of recovery in jobs for US-born workers over that period. The reason for this, according to the study, is that unauthorized immigrant workers and US-born workers are not substitutes. They're not competing for the same jobs. Unauthorized immigrants take low-paying, dangerous, and less attractive jobs more frequently than both US-born workers and authorized immigrant workers. When employers are unable to hire unauthorized workers, they often have to scale back their businesses, which causes job losses for US-born workers. Caregiving and household service jobs are very common amongst unauthorized immigrants. And
I don't like this argument because the very presence of a certain group is going to shift the economy and shift jobs. So, for example, if you have a lot of unskilled people coming in, there's going to be unskilled jobs created for those people. And the whole capital structure, economic structure will be shifted in a certain direction. And if those people leave, then the whole capital structure will be shifted elsewhere. And so I don't like this argument because it is, again, like ceteris paribus, all else equal, this is what will happen. And it's not going to be all else equal.
When they go away, people end up cleaning their own homes, mowing their own lawns, and often find it cheaper to look after children and elderly relatives at home rather than pay for care. A decline in the supply of childcare workers led to a reduction in the number of college-educated mothers in the workforce, according to the study. The paper
That's a very good point as well. I mean, if we're talking about fertility and demographics being one of the best arguments for this, you can boost your demographics most likely by doing that, because he just said that the number of women going to college declined. And so, and fertility is highly correlated with school years, the number of school years that females complete. And so, anyways, let's continue.
shows that unauthorized immigrants contribute to local demand for goods and services too, like haircuts, food, and cars, meaning that deportations lead to less revenue for local hairstylists, grocery stores, and car dealerships, causing them to hire fewer US-born workers. Finally, deportations impact tax revenues and facilitate the solvency of the Social Security and Medicare systems, as illegal immigrants who work pay into these systems while not being eligible to receive any benefits. The US agriculture industry relies heavily on temporary foreign workers to harvest farm produce, and are warning that deportation plans could create mass labour shortages, crippling farms and raising food prices. Warwick McKibben of the Australian National University looked at the economic implications of the planned deportations, building a global macro model to compare different scenarios where over the next 2 years either 1.3 million workers are removed or 7.5 million workers are removed. It's quite a detailed model, as mass migration affects both the US and other countries, affecting production networks, financial flows, and leads to adjustments in other countries that then feed back to the US. His model shows that removing a lot of workers from the economy causes a drop in GDP, as you'd expect. When workers disappear from a sector like agriculture or services, he shows that the capital that's currently deployed in that sector can't be quickly redeployed elsewhere, and so the return on capital in the United States falls as there's less economic activity associated with that capital. His model shows that mass deportations would have an effect on the business cycle too, as when the return on capital declines, incomes fall, shareholder returns fall, and overall spending in the economy declines. According to his model, the effect on the business cycle has a remarkably small spillover to other countries. With 1.3 million deportations, he estimates that US GDP would fall by 1.2%. And with 7.5 million deportations, GDP would fall by 7.4%. His model shows that the deportations would be inflationary too, and once again, more deportations leads to more inflation. He assumes that the Federal Reserve responds to inflation by hiking rates, but is limited as to what they can do due to the slowing economy. With regard to the inflationary effects, you can see with the coloured lines on this chart that this is inflationary for other economies too, but the greatest impact occurs in the United States. Interestingly, under this analysis, removing a lot of workers from the US economy improves the trade balance, one of the things that Trump has said that he wants to do. The reason this happens is that when the return on capital in the United States falls, foreign investment stops flowing to the US economy, going instead to where expected returns are higher. This causes the US dollar to weaken, which boosts exports and reduces imports. The farming sector would be hit hardest by deportations. A report from the University of California, Davis estimates that almost 1 million of Americans' 2.5 million farm workers are unauthorized immigrants. Dairy and poultry farms are particularly reliant on them, but the loss of these workers could be offset by increased automation. Construction costs in America.
Yeah, it could be offset by a lot of things. And, you know, anytime, like I told you at the beginning about the word inflation, and then we have this, where was it? This graph with inflation. What are they counting? They're probably counting prices, and they're not. Like, this just makes me question all of this analysis, because there's no way we can tell this. It's way too complex. And that maybe they're talking about prices here versus money printing. The downstream effects, you can see this goes all the way out to 2040 if we deport these people now. There's absolutely no way that they can model this or tell this, and so that makes me question everything else in this paper, in this report. I mean, it is something that you need to consider, but I just I don't buy it. Going back to this one, GDP, again, we don't know, especially out to 2040, because it could be a thing where, yes, we have a couple slow quarters or we have a slow year, and then instead of having to pay taxes to house all these illegal immigrants, instead of having all of this crime from these people and possible terrorism from these people affecting our economy, we won't have that, right? And so it's very, very hard to make these types of these models that incorporate everything. I would say that this is almost worthless, but at least it's something. And I don't want to, I hate really denigrating people's work like this, because I know they spent a lot of time. They probably made these models up and spent, a huge amount of investment into making these types of papers, but it's probably close to worthless, but it is a place to start. So let's continue on. We're about here.
2.5 million farm workers are unauthorized immigrants. Dairy and poultry farms are particularly reliant on them, but the loss of these workers could be offset by increased automation. Construction costs in America would...
Yeah, what I wanted to say about could be replaced by increased automation. That's also something that nobody considers, right? When they talk about this type of stuff, it's going to shift the capital structure towards technology or towards other things. It might even shift our eating habits. So if it's reliant on low-cost labor right now, and that's what makes certain berries or fruits, like those strawberries that they showed them picking the strawberries, it makes them more expensive. Well, there could be a substitution effect towards something that doesn't require that type of labor, And so there's all sorts of moving parts here. And it's very hard to say anything specifically about what the outcome, maybe very near outcome, like 1 to 2 years, but anything past that is very hard to predict.
Likely rise too, as 1.5 million unauthorized migrants work in that industry, which would be much harder to automate. Housing experts already say that the US is not building enough new homes, but obviously the reduction in building would be offset by a reduction in population, but not every American would want to live in the types of homes or in the locations where undocumented workers currently live. McKibbin's study is very interesting, but it does contain a lot of assumptions and a lot of moving parts, so it's unlikely to be a perfect predictor of outcomes, but it does help illuminate how a labour shock would impact the US economy. I'll put a link to a presentation by McKibbin in the video description for those of you who are interested. One of the big impacts of either a flood of immigration or mass deportations is that they cause shocks which have economic effects. In border states, when a rush of new migrants arrive, problems arise from there not being enough housing, school places, or employment for the new arrivals. Similarly, when a large number of immigrants who have become embedded in a community suddenly leave, it has harmful effects too. According to Pew Research, nearly 80% of unauthorized migrants in the United States have lived there for more than a decade. Many of these people are deeply integrated. 6% of all American school children have at least one unauthorized parent, meaning that 4.4 million American children would be affected by deportations. While immigration has been a heated topic, roughly 60% of American voters still say that undocumented immigrants already in the country should be allowed to stay in the country legally, either with a path to citizenship or a right to a work visa. In Sarah O'Connor's piece in the Financial Times on whether migrants were undercutting the wages of domestic workers or not, she described how the arrival of migrants can change the nature of certain types of work. She gives the example of how employers in certain sectors like meatpacking in the UK responded to the availability of Eastern European migrant workers by changing or expanding in ways that they might not otherwise have done.
This is exactly what I was talking about. So it has a shift on the structure of the economy. If you have all this low unskilled labor, the cheap labor, it's going to shift you to other it's you have different inputs, and if you think of an economy like a algorithm, well, if you change the inputs, the output is going to be different. And so that's exactly what this lady was writing about in the Financial Times. That the very fact that the immigrants were there changed how farmers did things.
When the migrant workers arrived, British meat processing plants shifted to 12-hour shifts and began opening facilities in more remote locations because they could find migrant workers willing to work there and the real estate was cheaper. She describes how farmers in the UK responded to the availability of seasonal workers by planting more labour-intensive soft fruits than before. She points out that many of the sectors that employ migrant workers have very tight profit margins as they sell to grocery chains who negotiate very low prices that they then pass on to their customers. In the wake of Brexit, many hoped that wages for British workers would rise now that the Eastern European workers were gone. But that didn't really work out. Farmers instead had to deal with crops rotting in their fields and complained about having to slaughter healthy animals due to labour shortages. The British government eventually gave in and handed out more visas to recruit migrant workers. With mass deportations, it's likely that the cost of food and housing will rise in the United States as labour shortages occur. It's also possible that certain American-made goods could be swapped for imports if local production became too expensive. We'll just have to wait and find out if investors or economists are right about how Trump's plans will affect the stock market and the economy. It seems to me that Trump keeps an eye on the stock market as a measure of his performance in office, and for that reason he might back down from certain ideas if they appear to be hurting the economy. Trump is also likely to face legal challenges in rounding up immigrants and pushback from other politicians over the extreme costs of his deportation plans. And for that reason, I think the worst case scenarios outlined in the various studies are unlikely.
Okay, that's it. Let me check for comments. No other comments. Let me check Telegram, see if there's any in there. All right. Basically, I think that this will happen. Now, whether you like it or not, that's the way the wind is blowing. Globally, we are going towards more nationalist populism, and reducing immigration is a key part of that. So that is the way that this is going. Now, without labeling that good or bad, what are the effects? That's why I like the last part of this video when he talks about when he brings up that article from the Financial Times where the lady said it shifts how they do things and what they produce. And the other way is also true. Now, in the case of the UK, they said they had to let things rot in their fields. Was that from regulations or what exactly? Was that strictly a labor shortage outcome or what? And maybe let it go another couple of years and it will fix itself. Okay, so remember, there is always countervening forces. It's a lot of these arguments are linear and just extrapolated in a linear fashion without understanding what's the force is going to push back on them. And some of those forces are going to be not just substitutes for foreign goods, like he said here at the end, where if the prices are too high in the US, then we're going to buy cheaper foreign imports. It could also be that we just simply don't buy those things. And we increase our savings. I remember talking to, I think it was Jeff Booth when he was on FedWatch, and we were talking about tariffs and things. And I think he was saying something about tariffs' effect on prices. And I was like, well, is it possible that we just simply stop buying those things? Like our society is so materialistic. You can go on to Amazon and you can find, one of the things I've noticed in the last year is just how many brands, they're just crazy foreign Chinese brands for everything. And so is it a fact that if there's tariffs put on those things and those things are more expensive, that we would still want to buy this plastic piece of garbage widget? No, not necessarily. It's also possible that we just don't buy those things, or we buy 10% less and use the savings to buy bigger ticket items or whatever. There's a shift in spending, like we saw with COVID. Okay, so spending on goods versus services is a certain percentage, right? In the economy. I don't know. Let's just say it's 50-50. You spend 50% of your spending on goods and 50% on services. Well, during COVID, you couldn't spend that on services. So what did people do? They still spent it, but they spent it on goods. So there was a gigantic increase in demand for goods right when the supply chains were shutting down. So the shift in the quality of the demand has a big effect. And we don't know what that would necessarily be as we go down this social experiment that we're going on right now towards national populism. So that's what I have to say about this one. Let me check if there's any comments. I wanted to go through one more. Dex, thanks for keeping me company. Work. Yeah, man. Thanks for hanging out every time. I was going to do one more video, but it is already 4:37. I'll try to keep this one short. We'll just do the first few minutes. And if you guys request for me to do the rest of the video, we will do that. But let's play this. This is Jeff Ross on what Bitcoin did. Let's go.
So last time we spoke, the topic of that show was Bitcoin as the ultimate reserve asset, which aged like fine wine and is obviously very topical right now. So can we start talking about the Trump admin and what's going to happen with Bitcoin? I'm going to give you some hot takes and I'll see what you agree with and see what you don't agree with.
Yeah.
So I think day one, I do believe Trump will free Ross. I think that's probably, in terms of like the Bitcoiner community, the most important promise for him to keep. But I don't think he's going to sign a strategic Bitcoin reserve executive order on day one. I actually don't think he may even mention Bitcoin for a little while. And I think on the back of that, it'll be like a sell and news type event. Bitcoin will crash a little bit for a couple of days and then back off to the races. I don't know what you think is going to happen here. Because we're only like, what is it, 6 days out?
Yeah, it's coming up next Monday, the 20th. So we're doing this on the 14th. Okay, I do think he will free Ross. If he does not free Ross, the Bitcoiners will come at him with their pitchforks and torches, and the cyber hornets will go off on him. So even if he didn't do it on day one, he'll do it on day two at the very latest. But I think it'll be a day one decision. The strategic Bitcoin reserve, based on the comments I've heard of him, I think I'm aligned with you. I do not think he will sign something right off the bat. I think this is going to be more of a congressional issue. I won't be surprised if they hang on to the Bitcoin that was confiscated by the Department of Justice, with the whole Silk Road deal. I hope they sell it, by the way. I just want to be on record. I've posted this on Nostr too. I don't think the U.S. government is worthy of the Bitcoin they seized. And if they're not going to give it back to the rightful owners, which they're clearly not, it's, that's what, 11 years ago or 10 years ago or so. I think they should just put it on the free market and let the true Bitcoiners buy it up.
Can we actually talk about that before we move on? Because that's interesting. Because if the Bitcoin was seized in like, on a legal basis, right? And if they seize cash on a legal basis, they keep it. So why do you think the Bitcoin should go back?
Because this is sort of a morality issue. I just think they're unworthy of the Bitcoin that they seized, and I don't think you should be able to just take the property of somebody else, even if they don't like how it was done, right? And I get it. This is a legal process. It was done legally, but I disagree with their implications that what Silk Road was this horribly terrible thing.
Oh, I agree with you there.
Right. So it flew in the face of the U.S. government monetary and financial control, right? They do not like it. They did not like everything about it. So the whole framing of Ross as a bad guy, the whole framing of Silk Road as this illicit, horrible, terrible place, and it serves them right. We get to take their stuff away from them. I just don't like any of the framing of it. And again, it's probably me as a libertarian. I tend to be more of a freedom maxi. They weren't hurting anybody for the most part through that. So I just disagree with the whole premise. So I don't think the Bitcoin, if it doesn't belong to the Silk Road participants, then it also doesn't belong to the government, even though it was obtained through legal measures. So
I agree with that, from a moral perspective. But what does that moral perspective buy us? It doesn't buy us any more understanding of what's going on. Perhaps if they returned it, then that would decrease the incentive to adopt a Bitcoin standard. So we don't know what the unintended consequences are of them returning that Bitcoin, and what the net benefit would be. But yes, from a strictly moral perspective, I definitely agree with that. They should not have seized it. Bitcoin also, or the U.S. government has also seized the Bitcoin from the Bitfinex hack. So there's multiple origins of the Bitcoin that the U.S. government is holding. I think they've sold a lot of the Silk Road Bitcoins already, right? They've had many auctions throughout the years, and just like Jeff is saying, that they have offered it back to the market. So again, going down this moralistic road, I agree, but it doesn't really buy us any sort of understanding of what's going to happen and what the outcomes of the likely scenarios going forward are.
What's the only solution? They obviously aren't going to give it back to anybody, so I think they should just sell it all on the free market.
Okay, I can get on board with that. Sorry, I interrupted you, so carry on with your flow.
It's okay. Okay, strategic Bitcoin reserve. Like you, I don't think it happens on day one. I think they may keep that Bitcoin, although I hope they actually do sell it. Will they actually start buying, what's the term, like 200,000 Bitcoin per year for 5 years, so they have 1 million? I know that's been floated around.
Uh-huh.
Maybe. If they were smart, that's exactly what they would do. I'm not convinced that they all understand Bitcoin as well as Bitcoiners think they do.
Sure.
They're very pro crypto, and that bothers me very much. They get Bitcoin, but then the next thing they talk about is crypto and all this crypto legislation. And so I'm concerned that we're going to have another circus, clown show, crypto bull market where people are going to, go up 1,000x and they're going to lose their shirts and go down 99%. And it's going to be sort of backed by the current administration. That part
100% agree with that.
concerns me.
Mm-hmm.
So what I really like to see are people when they first get into Bitcoin is, do they really understand what it is they own? I keep using the phrase that the U.S. government is not worthy of Bitcoin yet. So until I see that they actually understand it, until somebody like Cynthia Lummis truly represents the heart of the government, then yes, they would be worthy of it. But until I see more evidence that they're not just treating it like some other crypto, or some other kind of nonsense, then I don't think they should be keeping it as a reserve asset. And I will say, if I can say one more thing, it is inevitable, and I've been saying this for years and years and years, it's inevitable that Bitcoin will eventually become the world's reserve currency and the world's reserve asset. We're on that trajectory. People hate the term inevitable because they think that implies no human effort. I think there's going to be tons of human effort from Bitcoiners who understand Bitcoin, and because of that effort, Bitcoin will become inevitably the world's reserve asset and the world's reserve currency in time, in decades.
Again, I agree with him. I think it is inevitable, and it will require human effort. But that human effort is a result of natural incentives. So if you hold Bitcoin, you're naturally incentivized to evangelize it. You're naturally like me starting this podcast way back in 2016, when I saw things going on in the scaling conflict that I wanted to talk about, I was naturally incentivized to start the podcast. I was naturally incentivized to evangelize Bitcoin. And so that is why it's inevitable. It's inevitable because of economic laws and game theory and all of these other things. But yes, it is inevitable. Now, they did also kind of poo-pooed on the strategic reserve, but Jeff did say that they're not going to sell the Bitcoin that they hold. And so they just turn that into a Bitcoin strategic reserve. I think that is highly, highly likely, very quickly. Within a very short period of time, maybe not the first day, like they said, but maybe the first week, they announce something like that. And so, that to me would be a Bitcoin strategic reserve. If you look at Polymarket, let me just bring that up real quick. The one that people have been quoting recently is not the same one as has been around for a while, but I have to refresh this tab. This is the one that's been around for a while. Will Trump create a Bitcoin reserve in the first 100 days? And nothing in this actually says that it has to be the Lummis bill, right? It just has to be taking the existing Bitcoin and saying, this is now our stockpile. It's now our Bitcoin reserve. Within the first 100 days, I think that's almost a lock, to be honest with you. It's way higher. So this is easy money. If you're outside the United States, I think this is a good bet. Not financial advice, though. But okay, let's go back to the video and continue.
I completely agree with that. And I think that hands are going to be forced as well. Like I'm fairly confident from people I've spoken to that the UAE hold a significant amount of Bitcoin, whether that's 200, 300, 400,000 coins, whatever. That's going to play into it. And I think that may end up forcing the US's hand in some way, maybe quite quickly. But in terms of like this Bitcoin cycle, how important do you think?
Well, Trump definitely knows if there is, if the UAE is holding Bitcoin.
The US involvement is?
I think it's just basically I think it's important for this cycle, as you say. I think it's going to be the main driver that will push us to the next level. So I'm still holding on to my thesis or my guess of Bitcoin at a price target of about 475,000 by the fourth quarter of 2025. And that's because of now mild nation state involvement. So the US will probably get involved to some degree. That should start a bit of a foot race for Bitcoin, but I don't think it will be as impressive as a lot of people think. You know, we had MicroStrategy last cycle. Now we have a handful of companies doing the Bitcoin treasury strategy. It's great to see, but it's still just a teeny tiny drop in the bucket so far. But that's enough, I think, enough interest to help push the price higher in this next cycle. So once we see liquidity really start to take off, I think that's what will propel Bitcoin to, you know, a 500K valuation, maybe a million, who knows? My range is anywhere from 200,000 to a million at some point. And then I think people will get over leveraged again, like people always do, because they get caught up in the hype and they do stupid things. And then we have another crash after that. And then the next cycle, I think, will be more of nation state involvement kind of early on. And we'll start seeing nation states stacking at a more significant level.
One thing they did not talk about was the SAB 121. That's going to be overturned instantly. And that is a pretty big deal, allowing banks to custody Bitcoin. So they didn't talk about that. And he didn't talk about what we watched Nick Bhatia last week. And Nick Bhatia was talking about these printing of money directly to buy Bitcoin through these convertible notes and things like that. And so this analysis, Jeff's analysis, is more concentrated on liquidity versus fundamental changes to how money is coming into Bitcoin. So not only do we have this, did he call it soft nation state adoption, but we also have this printing of money directly into Bitcoin. And those two things put together have the possibility, now I think it's on a lower end of possibility, to take us to $1 million or higher this cycle. You know, we're talking 10% chance that we get to $1 million or higher. But there's no talk about that at all. The printing of the money side of the house, it's all about liquidity. So I would just add that.
And that's probably, I do want to talk to you about like the 4-year cycle, but I guess when nation states are stacking at a significant level, that might be when that 4-year cycle actually gets broken. But before we get to that, do you ever follow the halving tracker?
I do, but I don't put a ton of stock into it.
Okay, tell me why.
Because I think that and this is what, to me, it seems really obvious, but I think this confuses a lot of people. I think most people put too much stock in the halving, and I used to as well, but I do less and less. And I think what we're seeing in these huge waves that happen about every 4 years are just liquidity waves into Bitcoin itself. So what happens is we get to the point in the economic cycle where countries, as businesses and nations, are trying to roll over their debt. The dollar shortage gets acute, and actually we're kind of at that stage right now where we're starting to feel the pressure of this dollar shortage around the world. So central banks, by some action, there'll be something like the gilt crisis back in October, I think, of 2023. Yep. Something will happen that will cause central banks to get heavily involved. Probably even though the U.S. itself the economy is doing pretty well, the Federal Reserve will get involved, maybe through liquidity swaps, maybe through who knows what actions they'll do, but they'll do some way to push out the dollar out around the world to our allies and maybe indirectly to like China, our frenemies, and places like that. And that will trigger, I think, finally rates will roll over a bit. The dollar will finally break and roll over, and then that will free up other central banks from other nations to finally start doing their own quantitative easing. That will be that rush of liquidity, and we'll see that reflected in the price of Bitcoin, which will go up, up, up. And like, as we said, at some point, we run out of buyers. Everybody has leverage, you know, and it's when your grandma finally calls and says, I'm all in right here. That's when we know we've probably hit the top and we're going to have another 70 to 80% decline.
So he is actually describing the pre-recession trade that I have been on for about, 18 months or so, saying that as we're rolling into recession, we actually have a push into stocks, Bitcoin, and bonds. That's what he described. Bonds rolling over, liquidity getting pushed into the system, meaning Bitcoin and risk assets like stocks going higher. So that he's kind of describing the pre-recession trade there. Now, he also said something else. I don't think he's gotten to it yet, but so let's continue.
So I think it's going to be the same until I see otherwise. I think we're going to see that same cycle.
So do those liquidity cycles tend to be in 4-year cycles as well?
Yes, they do.
What drives that?
Okay, so everything changed during the global financial crisis or the great financial crisis back in 2008, 2009. That was when the central banks and especially the Federal Reserve took control of the markets. They basically said, yeah, it was kind of free market stuff beforehand. We were kind of piddling with it before, but now we've just taken control of it. They jammed the rates, the interest rate back down to zero. And that basically gave everybody free reign on their debt. Everybody got a debt jubilee when they did that. And that started when businesses started taking debt. They usually take debt that's about 3 to 5 years in length, so an average of 4 years. And about every 3 to 5 years or 4 years on average, they have to roll that debt over again. And so when they try to do that, what happens is we see this dollar shortage and euro dollar shortage, not just in the US, but all around the world, because the whole world runs on the US, obviously, as a reserve currency and reserve asset. If there are not enough dollars out there, things start to get tight. So we see tremors in the system, and we're actually starting to see that now. One sign is you start seeing the dollar strengthen, so the Dixie rises. You can see Treasury rates start to rise as well. We're seeing that. We were talking beforehand. The gilt is about 5%. 10-year Treasuries right now are about 4.8% or so. That's a kind of pressure that, everybody thinks the Federal Reserve cares about the stock markets. They don't care about the stock markets. They care about the bond markets. They care about treasuries. And so when they see that there is a liquidity problem happening, I wish they would proactively act. Like I wish they would start doing stuff right now. But what they're going to do is wait till some sort of crisis happens. And then that's going to trigger them to, okay, we're going to flood the system somehow. It can be creative measures. It can be traditional measures, but they'll flood the system with new dollars or with new dollar collateral, which are just short-term T-bills or longer-term treasuries.
Well, they try to get ahead of it. At least Powell is trying to get ahead of it, right? He did this in 2019. He cut 3 times in 2019 before the repo rumble and before COVID. We thought we were going into recession at that time, and he preemptively cut. He preemptively cut this time as well, 25 basis points more than he did in 2019. So they're trying to get ahead of it. But it also reminds me of what we've talked about here on the show, and Milton Friedman and the Monetarist. If you go back in time 30, 40 years, the idea was Milton Friedman said, if monetary policy is a reaction, then you're always going to be behind, right? Because not only does an event have to happen and then you have to react, which is a lag in itself, but then it's going to take time for the monetary policy transmission, the transmission of the monetary policy out there into the economy, which will be another lag of they don't know. Like this is one of these things that they have no idea what they're talking about when they talk about lag of monetary policy transmission. But it could be 1 to 2 years even. And so like that's what Milton Friedman said. You're always behind. And that's what Jeff Ross is saying here, is that they always react. Well, that's because that's the way the system is set up. Milton Friedman said we need to target money supply. Okay, we need to target money supply, and so that's when they started really hunkering down, targeting M1. That didn't work. M2, M3. Then they realized that they don't know how to measure money. And so they got rid of M3. They went back to M2. And now these guys are going to talk about M2 here in this episode. But he's also talking about liquidity and how are you measuring that? I'm thinking Jeff is measuring it with M2, global liquidity. But that is not liquidity. Okay. M2 actually expands during illiquid times. And it doesn't contract. It contracts a little bit during more liquid times, maybe, but it actually expands during the illiquid times. So I would question how you're measuring liquidity as a basis of your cycles here. But it is interesting that he said that the average term of these loans is 3 to 5 years. I guess for business loans and stuff, even international business loans and things would be 3 to 5 years. And so they kind of average out to 4 years. I think the halving still has a psychological effect. I mean, it does have some like a deflationary spiral effect because you're cutting the new issuance. But as we go on, it's going to have a more psychological effect. It will even become like a holiday type thing, I think, 20 years down the road. And it just cements the idea that this is a truly fixed supply. And so, no, the halving still definitely matters. But I agree that it will matter less and less from a mechanical perspective as we go forward, obviously. Also, I've done some analysis on like election years and other things and how that, the 4-year cycle in relation to elections or the halving, which is more powerful. And it still comes down to the halving. So um, if it wasn't the halving, it wouldn't be so precisely timed. I mean, you can look at like tops compared to halvings, and they're very, very within a tiny margin of error. Some people say like, I've seen things like 167 days is when the top happens after the bot, or after a certain technical event in Bitcoin happens. So it's just amazing that it's so precise. So you can't discount that because there's no other model that you could say down to pretty much the week that you're going to have a top. There's no other model to tell you that. So I still think the halving has a significant impact in the Bitcoin market.
And then that liquidity wave comes in, and then companies then are able to roll their debt for another 3 to 5 years, usually about 4 years or so. And that's why we get these cycles. So I think it's a red herring that it happens to be in sync with the presidential, the US presidential cycle, and with the Bitcoin halving cycle. I think those are rings. I think what it really is that we're seeing are waves.
This episode is brought to you by CASA. For those of you out there who want to protect, the Fed started tightening. In 2021, they were tightening and M2 was dropping. Do you think they're the real reasons for like Bitcoin price topping out rather than anything else? Like the FTX thing obviously was a big deal in 2021. But do you put more on the macro side than you do in like the internal Bitcoin stuff?
I put it all on the macro stuff. I mean, I run a macro hedge fund based on these kind of things. So the way I think here's the way it works in my world. We see these flows of liquidity. First of all, everything is cyclical. So everything moves in a sine wave. And it took me years and years and years of investing to understand this. So if you're hearing this for the first time, take this seriously. And not to you, Danny, but to your listeners, everything is cyclical. I promise you. And so things go up and they go down and they go up and they go down. And so first, usually what we see are waves of liquidity. And about sometime after that, usually 9 to 12 months or so, we see the economic cycle recover. And then what happens is the cycle starts to heat up. We see commodity prices start to rise. Ironically, that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing oil and other commodities are really starting to take off again. They get to the point where sort of mid-cycle, we start seeing that reflected in goods in prices or goods inflation. And then we see services inflation at the end, and that's sort of late cycle stuff. So what happens is when we start getting high and we start to see the economy overheat, which is what I expect in 2025, I think we're going to have a strong economy as 2025 takes off. I think manufacturing is going to take off. I think the US will actually pull the rest of the world out of this sort of slump that they're in, the stagflationary slump that Europe is in and China is certainly in as well, although China is kind of its own deal, but definitely the US-centric companies. What happens is as the economy starts to overheat, we start to see interest rates continue to go higher because long-term treasury rates are based on future growth and inflation expectations. When they start to get too high, that gets hard on the markets, and it gets also hard on the lower classes, right? Because if inflation is running too high, like we saw back in 2022 and so on, it gets very difficult for people just to pay the bills. What happens then is the central banks, especially the Fed, will start saying, you know what, the economy is getting too strong, it's getting overheated, too hot, we need to withdraw liquidity. So that's what I watch that like a hawk because I want to see what's happening, because that's a leading indicator. When we see the Fed even talking about withdrawing liquidity again, there's a lag, and then the economic cycle starts to turn over as well. And when that's somewhere in there, depending on which asset we're talking about, if we're talking Bitcoin, it's super sensitive to liquidity.
Yep.
Usually trades on about somewhere between like a 7 and 15 lag. And I got to give credit for this to Michael Howell of Cross Border Capital.
I want to rewind.
And then the economic cycle starts to turn over as well. And when that's somewhere in there, depending on which asset we're talking about. If we're talking about Bitcoin, it's super sensitive to liquidity.
Yep.
It usually trades on about somewhere between like a 7 and 15 week lag. And I got to give credit for this to Michael Howell of Cross Border Capital. He actually did some work to discover this. So there's about a 7 to 15 week lag with an average of about 12 weeks. So about a 12-week lag after we see an action in global liquidity, Bitcoin does that. It kind of follows that same action. And then everything just starts over again. So basically liquidity gets withdrawn. People start having a tough time paying their debts. The economy starts to roll over. Stocks sense that. So stocks start crashing as well. And then you usually have a traditional bear market. So that's how it always works. Sometimes it doesn't. I will say one last thing, and then I'll quit blathering. COVID really threw a lot of things off. That didn't happen at exactly the right time, although it was close to the right time, but it was such a huge hit to the system, and where, they disrupted the supply chain, and then the government came in, especially here in the US, and they just gave everybody money. So transfer payments directly into the bank accounts of people with the supply chain stopped and these huge cash influxes that caused inflation to spike, and it just threw off the markets. And then the markets since then have basically just been normalizing and recovering. But I think now we're sort of back into a traditional cycle where I expect to see the economic growth and inflation positioned to both be interesting throughout 2025.
Okay. Very good explanation of the cycles. And I agree. I'm a big person in cycles, not only market cycles, but even seasonality. If you guys have watched my stuff for any period of time, every year around the end of Q1 and Q3, these are cyclical crunch points or bottlenecks throughout the year. So I do definitely believe in cycles. And he's brought up previously, just a couple minutes ago, about the great financial crisis and how that changed everything. Okay, so in his analysis of liquidity going up and down and how this market is going to progress, he is acknowledging that the cycle changed in the great financial crisis. He also is acknowledging that it changed in COVID. Okay, and I would add an even different long-term cycle, and that is the global credit bubble, the credit-based dollar that really got going in 1971 and expanding in the 70s with the great inflation, hitting its peak in the great financial crisis, and now on the unwind side. So these are all cycles, sine wave upon sine wave upon sine wave of different lengths. Okay. There's also things like the Plaza Accord, Bretton Woods. And that's where these international players from all the large economies and probably large banks get together and come up with a new system, a new plan. And so his liquidity analysis, we'll get to what exactly liquidity is in a minute, but it's always kind of different this time because you have the longer term, the medium term, and the short term sine waves, and they're all going to kind of interact at different times at different cycles. So each cycle is different, and he acknowledges that with the great financial crisis and with COVID, but why doesn't he acknowledge that on other timescales? Now to the liquidity thing. What exactly is liquidity? Global Capital, I think, is an account on Twitter that has this global liquidity wave that they show. And you dig in and you're like, what is global liquidity? It's mainly M2. Okay. And I just said M2 expands during illiquid times, not during liquid times. And so if you're basing everything around liquidity, let's have a very precise definition of what liquidity is. Maybe Jeff would say that is the ability to roll over your debt. That's liquidity. That's true. But when we have a liquidity crisis, like in the repo rumble or the great financial crisis or COVID, when we have these liquidity, or like China's having right now, a liquidity crisis is not about rolling over a debt. It's about a mass exodus to collateral. That's why rates crash, because the circulation in the shadow banking system, in repo and all these other ways of financing stuff stops. So liquidity isn't that has nothing to do with M2. Okay, the shadow banking system and repo has nothing to do with M2. So let's really dive down on what exactly is meant by liquidity here, because I don't think it's what Jeff is saying.
One of the interesting things you said there, I mean, I've honestly written about 20 questions down from that. But one of the interesting things you said there was COVID didn't fall at quite the right.
But I'll add, overall, I think we're very close to being aligned on how we see the economy. And he uses some different terms in this episode that I 100% agree with. And I haven't heard very many other Bitcoiners talking like that. So I think we're very, very close to total agreement. It's just slight things like, what do you mean by liquidity? Why aren't you incorporating these longer term cycles? Things like that.
Right time. But I remember a really interesting interview that we did on What Bitcoin Did, probably end of 2019, with Travis Kling and Caitlin Long. And it was when the repo market was blowing out. And they were then saying, something's wrong, we don't know what it is, but something's going to break. And then COVID happened. And I wondered if that was like kind of efficient market hypothesis sort of thing, like seeing around a corner that you don't know the event, but something's going to happen.
Exactly.
But I want to get back to the cycles, because obviously one of the things that are quite often blamed on like Bitcoin tops is every man and his dog getting in is always a sign. And then like leverage blowing out, like people just going all in on Bitcoin, like above their means. Is that just a symptom of like the global liquidity cycle?
It is, because when liquidity is increasing, what that does is it puts first of all, so what happens here in the U.S., the Federal Reserve says, we've got treasuries covered. We're going to start buying treasuries. And what that means is the rest of you, investment institutions and regular, plebs here on the street, you can move further out on the risk curve. So we got this part of the low risk curve. You guys move out on the risk curve. So basically, there's this huge buyer that wasn't here. Like right now, they're not here. We're doing technically QT. We're allowing treasuries and mortgage-backed securities to roll off of the Fed balance sheet. At some point, they're going to pop back in, boom. And what that does is everybody shifts over on the risk curve. And so that's what starts this move higher in risk assets. And people start to think, man, I'm an awesome investor. And I made 2x in Bitcoin, but man, I bought Doge and I'm up 100x. I'm a brilliant investor, right? That people start thinking like that. And then they're like, man, if I can make 100x in Doge, why wouldn't I use leverage? And then I can make 1,000x in Doge. So
okay, so his explanation there of QE doesn't match what actually happens during QE. That is the textbook definition of what they're trying to do. Okay, they're trying to make your balance sheets look good, so you go out there and lend. You move down the risk curve, he says, to more risky loans, and you expand the money supply that way. But it didn't work in Japan. It didn't work in the U.S. Actually, during QE, rates go up during QE. Then when QE stops, rates continue to fall. So yes, that is the textbook definition of how QE works, but that's not how it works in reality. We watched a video here on the show before where they just don't shift. So that there was some guy, it was some small channel. I guess he turned out to be an MMTer, but he was talking about QE and the way it's supposed to work, shifting them down the risk curve. But in reality, all it does is cut off one side of the risk curve for these businesses and actually makes it like less, or makes it more risky for them. When they actually have to do their calculations and stuff, it makes a certain part of the risk curve just not possible to go, even though they need to go there with their all the calculations that they do. So anyways, enough of that, guys. It's getting here late. It's 5:08 p.m. Eastern time. I've been live streaming for an hour and 30 minutes. If you want me to respond to the rest of this, maybe we can do that on the next live stream. But thank you for joining me. Let's see if there's any comments. Let's get started on the weekend. No more comments on there. Let me check and see in Telegram. Okay, no other comments. So guys, thanks again for hanging out. Hope you guys had a great week. Well, let's check the Bitcoin price before we go real quick. 104.6. No action at the end of the day here, really. We'll see if we get any action over the weekend. Might just be flat until Inauguration Day, and we get the SAB 121 announcement and possibly the infant stages of a Bitcoin strategic reserve on Monday. But that would be awesome. So thank you guys for joining me, and have a great weekend. See ya on the next one. Bye.